Anvise, hi.
Ready.
Are you ready?
മോനെ
Hi, good morning, Professor.
Oh, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. How are you?
I'm okay.
Yeah, yeah,
And yourself?
yeah. Fine too. Uh,
Good.
it's early morning. It's early morning for you?
It's early morning for me, and it was a late night watching the election results coming in. So
Oh, okay.
a little bit of
Okay.
coffee is getting my brain working now.
Okay. We'll begin by 5:15.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So if I have the time zones right, it'll be 5:15, like 6 minutes or something like that, right?
Yeah, 6 minutes
Okay,
more. Yes.
great.
Yeah. I hope you won't get the election result today. Will you get the Will you get the election result today?
Well, we should get it today or tomorrow, but Trump has already challenged the results, so it's a
Yeah.
very, I'd say it's a very dangerous situation here.
Okay.
We will see.
Hello, ma'am Tejasini. Good evening, Father. Prashant sir? Prashant sir?
Yes.
Shall we begin? It's
Okay.
5:15, so we will begin the inaugural, and others will join soon, I hope. Chelsea?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, let's begin. Let's begin.
Okay, sir. A very good morning to Professor David Livingston, and good evening to the galaxy of intellectuals, invited guests, delegates, and students. On behalf of the English Department of Sacred Heart College, St. Teresa's College, and Pratnya Foundation, I welcome you all to the International Webinar Series. The webinar is titled Individual, Collectivity, and Systematic Changes, and it aims to discuss the autonomy of the individual that has been challenged by systems operating at societal, national, and global levels. Pratnya Foundation works towards nurturing a community of committed teachers, researchers, and students interested in engaging with cultural and literary theories and directing this effort to resolving the problems of human life. I now request Dr. Rani Matthew, President of the Foundation, to deliver the welcome address.
Patron of Pratnya Foundation, Dr. N. Prashanta Kumar, Principal of Sacred Heart College, Reverend Father Prashant Palakapalli, Resource Person of the webinar, Professor David Livingston Smith, other dignitaries, advisory committee members, organizing committee members, founder members of Pratnya Foundation, and all delegates. A very warm welcome to the inaugural session of the International Webinar Series, Individual, Collectivity, and Systemic Challenges, jointly organized by Pratnya Foundation, Departments of English of Sacred Heart College and St. Teresa's College. I represent Pratnya Foundation, and before formally welcoming the invitees to the inaugural session, I would like to give you a very brief introduction to Pratnya Foundation, registered under Travancore Cochin Literary, Scientific and Charitable Societies Act 1955. Actually, I would like to call it the dream child of the students and friends of Dr. N. Prashanta Kumar, former professor and head of the Department of English, Sri Shankaracharya University, College. Prashant sir has always been a committed scholar in the domain of literary theory and cultural studies, and a very productive research guide. All of us who enjoyed his tutelage, all the research scholars fostered by this gentleman scholar, were very keen on doing something to keep him active, vibrant, and engaged even after his retirement. Why not we create a forum for literature, theory, and criticism in honor of Prashant sir? This was the first idea that sprang to our minds at the time of his retirement. And this foundation is our tribute to a guide who was tough and clear as well as kind and generous. I believe the binding force is, of course, passion for literature, theory, and criticism, but equally strong is the love and appreciation for Prashant sir. Our mission is to foster a community of committed teachers, researchers, and students interested in cultural and literary theories. Dr. Prashant Kumar, the inspirational impulse behind Pratnya Foundation, is here to inaugurate the webinar and introduce the topic. With immense pleasure, I welcome you, dear sir, to this inaugural session. One of the objectives of the foundation is to organize lectures and discussions. Our purpose is to offer a space to discuss and deliberate. We have already organized 3 endowment lectures. It was actually in Sacred Heart College that Pratnya Foundation was born officially. And it was there again that the first 3 annual endowment lectures were organized. As you know, today also Sacred Heart College is playing host. And we have here today Principal of the College, Reverend Dr. Prashant Palekapalli, to felicitate. Welcome, dear Father, to this opening session. Next, our resource person is Professor David Livingston Smith, Professor, Department of Philosophy, University of New England, USA. I understand he is a philosopher who strongly believes that the practice of philosophy will help us meet the challenges confronting humanity in the 21st century. We are all looking forward to a very active scholarly conversation with you, Dr. Smith, and I extend you a very hearty welcome.
Thank you.
Digital imperialism and cyber sovereignty. The last webinar in the series will be hosted by the Department of English, St. Teresa's College. Warm welcome to Dr. Sister Vinita, Director, Dr. Lizzie Matthew, Principal, and all the faculty members of the Department of English, St. Teresa's College. And thank you for your willingness to collaborate. Just I take this opportunity to welcome all the founder members and the organizing committee members to today's session. Special thanks and welcome to dear Dr. Johnson, the Chief Organizer and General Secretary of Pratnya Foundation. Welcome all participants who are logged in. Thank you. Thank you very much for encouraging us to go ahead with your presence. Welcome once again to this free intellectual space we offer you on the digital platform in line with the social distancing norms due to COVID-19 pandemic. Wish you all a very good, pleasant evening. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your wonderful words of welcome. A scholar who inspires, a fount of profound knowledge. I request Dr. N. Prashantakumar, patron of Pratnya Foundation, to formally inaugurate the webinar series and also introduce the concept of the webinar.
Dear Professor David Livingston Smith, Dr. Randy Matthew, Reverend Father Prashant Palekapalli, K.M. Johnson, academics, teachers, and friends. Let me first of all congratulate the office bearers of Pratnya Foundation and the institutions which collaborate with us for organizing a webinar series on a politically significant theme. You know, humanity is passing through a critical phase. The very notion of the human is being challenged by the recent untoward happenings in different parts of the world. You all know the human is a symbol of dignity, freedom, and intellect. The human face is a metaphor of reason. Democracy is the most congenial, appropriate, politically appropriate environment for the development of the human, for the development of humanity at large. But certain recent threats from which most of the liberal democracies of the world confront today, creates some anxieties about the future of democracy as well as the future of humanity at large. So we all know the inevitability or tragedy in human life, whether it is war or terror or the pandemic. But we are shocked by people's attitude to tragedies. See, people become helpless before. The people who do not directly experience tragedy become all the more helpless when they view them. They cannot initiate immediate action. Politicians can. Politicians are bound to initiate action. Therefore, the spectacles of suffering demand strategies, certain methods or discourses to call for action from the spectators of suffering. So it is in this context that distant suffering becomes important. Hannah Arendt's politics of pity is based on the distant suffering, the political significance of distant suffering. That is based on the logical necessity of considering distant suffering brought to our drawing room by the television images. The spectacle of distant suffering compels the spectator, imposes certain moral demands on the spectator to call for action. Therefore, politics of pity is based on observation of the suffering humanity, observation of the unfortunate masses. And politics of pity is not at all based on justice. It is based on the suffering of humanity. It is based on the unfortunate masses. Politics of pity, therefore, prevails over justice. In politics of pity, action prevails over justice. I therefore call upon all the academic, all the teachers to use the method of discourses. As spectators of suffering, especially spectators of distant suffering, we have to use the strategies of discourses, the methods of discourses to call for political action to mitigate the suffering of humanity. We have to demand compassion being directed towards the suffering humanity. I think that this is the political significance of the webinar. I am happy to say that the webinar is being officially inaugurated. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for that insightful introduction. A constant source of motivation who continually challenges us to strive for excellence. I now request our principal, Reverend Dr. Prashant Palakyapillil, to felicitate the gathering.
Namaskaram, everyone. Warm good afternoon. It might be morning or maybe just so salutations. Yeah, I feel very privileged to be here amidst you and very much challenged, not the systemic challenges, by the topic you've taken, I feel it's a very challenging topic. And I think Prajna Foundation and your collective is very symbolic of the topic itself. I feel we have the individual, very simplistically speaking, we have the individual Professor Prashant, and we have the collective Prajna doing great things. But my reflection from my own point of view is how far the collectivity is helping individual to overcome challenges of the everydayness which we are facing now. And on the other hand, are the individuals becoming increasingly victims of the systemic challenges because of the collectivity? This is also a question. I hope there will be great interest in this topic, and I really am glad to be part of this, and I deem it a great privilege that we are, thanks to Professor Prashant and the Prajna Foundation, such opportunities and such forums are being opened up for us to come together and to explore and to understand the reality around us. I wish the gathering the very best, and I hope that the series will be a wonderful beginning and not an end, and will be a continuity. I wish the gathering the very best, and I thank you. God bless.
Thank you, Father, for your thought-provoking speech. Mr. Aravinda Nair, Associate Professor, Department of English, is a young scholar and teacher who is currently pursuing his doctorate in science fiction. I now request Professor Aravind to introduce our resource person, the erudite Professor David Livingston Smith.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Professor David Livingston Smith, who will shortly deliver the first lecture of this international webinar series. Professor Smith is the Professor of Philosophy at the University of New England, where he teaches courses on philosophy of psychology, philosophy of mind, metaphysics, free will and determinism, philosophy of human nature, philosophy of race, and other topics. He earned his doctoral degree from the University of London for his work on Freud's philosophy of the mind and psychology. Professor Smith has authored or edited 9 books that explore the philosophy of human nature, ideology, race, and dehumanization. His book, titled Less Than Human: Why We Demean, Enslave, and Exterminate Others, was awarded the 2012 Anisfield Wolf Award for Nonfiction. His latest work is titled On Inhumanity, Dehumanization, and How to Resist It, and it is now available from Oxford University Press. Professor Smith's work is as fascinating as it is interdisciplinary and has been cited not only by other philosophers, but also by historians, legal scholars, psychologists, and anthropologists. The import and relevance of his work has not remained confined to the academia. It has been covered extensively by primetime visual media, newspapers, and radio. In 2012, he was a guest at the G20 Economic Summit, where he spoke on dehumanization and mass violence. Sir, we are truly privileged to have you with us here today. And I must say, you're also joining us on quite a fateful day for the United States, and by extension, the rest of the world as well. As we are all eagerly waiting for the news to drop about the elections, I would love to hear your thoughts on whether the whole process of democracy is still robust enough to resist the forces of dehumanization, or whether it is already too late. Professor will speak for an hour, and then we shall have questions after. I request the audience to keep your microphones muted during the talk. I now invite Professor Smith to deliver the lecture. Over to you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope you can all hear me. One never knows. You can. Great. It's such an honor to be invited to this event. I'm deeply honored indeed. And isn't it a miracle that we can speak to one another this way from halfway around the world? Yes, today's a fateful day for the United States and by extension the world. As you said, And I'm deeply worried. I'm deeply worried about it. But you began by posing the question, can democracy withstand the dehumanizing forces and other forces hostile to it, or is it too late? Well, we don't know. The party isn't over yet, right? The best we can do is work very hard to create the sort of world that we want to live in. Martin Luther King once said that the moral arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. I think it only bends towards justice if we push it very hard in that direction. And we keep pushing it, because as soon as we release the pressure, the arc of history bends towards injustice. And it bends towards injustice for reasons which I hope to describe a bit to you this morning. I'm going to just turn my timer on so I don't speak for 5 hours. There we go. And I was really sitting here wondering how I was going to start this conversation. And Dr. Kumar's words were really influential. His emphasis on suffering and our attitude toward suffering, I think, is extraordinarily important. So I think I want to begin there. I want to begin with some thoughts about our vulnerability to authoritarian leaders, our vulnerability to being manipulated by them. And what I want to emphasize is the role of suffering in that. And then I'll go on to talk a little bit about my main work, which is on dehumanization, how I understand it, why it's important, and so on. And I earnestly hope that the time I spend with you proves to be worthwhile and stimulating for you. So the issue of authoritarian leaders and how authoritarian leaders gain influence over us ordinary folks goes back a long way. In European philosophy, it goes back at least to Plato. Plato's Republic, his longest work, he describes a sequence of political forms, one of which is democracy. And Plato wasn't really too impressed by democracy. As you know, formally speaking, ancient Athens was a democracy. But only formally speaking. I mean, it was run basically by wealthy citizens, and it was a slave society. The reason Plato wasn't too impressed by democracy was, well, to make a long story short, Plato believed that democracy inevitably collapses into tyranny. And he believed it inevitably collapses into tyranny because sooner or later in a democracy, a leader arises who exploits the undisciplined, hedonistic desires of the populace. He promises them things, and he gains immense power by doing that. So Plato actually thought that the reason that this can happen, the reason that in a democracy, a charismatic leader can rise up and undo democracy, was that people are just stupid and foolish. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it. The famous passage, pardon me, in the Republic, he says, if a doctor and a pastry cook were competing with one another to offer food to the masses, the pastry cook would win. In other words, the politician who panders to our crude desires, who offers us sweet things which aren't nutritious, is more attractive than the doctor who understands what's needed for the health of the state. Now, Plato's diagnosis, I mean, obviously it's partially correct. One of the problems of democracy is that it protects the right to individual freedom of speech, and freedom of speech can be exploited to nefarious ends. Back in the 1920s, when the Nazi Party was rising in Germany, they were constantly complaining about restrictions to their freedom of speech. But beyond that, Plato's diagnosis is a little bit problematic because, as we know, those who follow authoritarian leaders, sometimes of the most destructive sort, are not necessarily stupid at all. I'm thinking now of the Wannsee Conference, a meeting of 15 senior Nazis that took place in a beautiful villa at the Wannsee just outside of Berlin in 1942. At this meeting, 8 of the 15 people sitting around the table planning the extermination of the Jews of Europe had PhDs in law, in theology, in all sorts of disciplines. So these were not stupid people by any means. And indeed, the Nazi SS, their elite paramilitary organization that ran the concentration camps and death camps, these men were more highly educated than the average, ordinary German. So there's got to be something deeper to look at when trying to understand this challenge of what it is about us that enables us, empowers us, makes it attractive to us to submit to dangerous, oppressive, authoritarian leaders. It seems terribly irrational. And when we, of course, think about irrationality, one of the people whose name pops into our heads, or at least should, is Sigmund Freud. I think Freud had an insight into this puzzle, not a complete insight by any means, but an insight. And oddly enough, it was voiced in his book published in 1927 about religion. That book is entitled The Future of an Illusion. Freud thought that religious beliefs were illusions, but he defined illusion in a very particular way, and that's what's really important to us. It's interesting to note that this little book was written under the shadow of the rise of fascism in Austria's northern neighbor, Germany. It was a year after the Nazis' first Nuremberg conference, or Nuremberg rally, I should say, this incredible political theater. And under the shadow of political chaos in Austria, with fighting in the street and an uptick in anti-Semitic violence. To understand Freud's position and its relevance to what our topic is today, we have to look at what he meant by an illusion. Normally, when we speak of illusions, we mean false beliefs or false perceptions. That's not what Freud meant. What Freud meant by illusion is a belief that we hold because we want it to be true. So not because of the evidence in its favor, but because we want it to be true. Now, if you think about illusions that way, it's not being false that makes them illusions. It's something about their psychological origin. And it also, if you think about it for a moment, you'll see that it allows for the possibility of true illusions, beliefs that are true, but are nonetheless beliefs that we hold because we want them to be true. They're true coincidentally, as it were. He gives an example of a child who wants to grow up and marry a prince. And this child, creates the fantasy that when she grows up, she's going to marry a prince and so on, with fairy tale sort of stuff. She forms that belief, and indeed, just coincidentally, it happens. She grows up and marries a prince. So her belief was an illusion, even though it was correct. You might have the belief that you're going to win a lottery. You wake up, oh, I feel like I had this dream. I know, I believe I'm going to win. And you buy a lottery ticket and you win by chance. It's accidental. So that was a true illusion. But illusions are more likely to be false. Now, as I said when I introduced Freud a moment ago, Freud thought that religious beliefs are illusions. And by religion here, he's talking really primarily about Christianity, actually, but more generally about the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, to a less extent, Judaism, but Judaism in a different kind of way, let's put it that way. Freud, as you may know, was of Jewish ethnicity and an atheist. So, why did Freud think that religious belief was illusion? Well, he thought it was a response to the human awareness of our own vulnerability and suffering. So this is where my thoughts went initially when I was listening to Dr. Kumar opening the conference. All living things suffer, but human beings are perhaps unique in having an awareness of our suffering and the sources of our suffering. And this adds to our suffering. You might want to say, we feel suffering, whereas other creatures more often simply feel pain. Suffering is has this psychological, emotional, or spiritual dimension to it that simple pain lacks. Freud used the term helplessness. We are helpless, and that's part of the human condition. And we are aware of our helplessness. What sort of helplessness? Well, Freud thought there were two primary sources of this sort of vulnerability. One is forces of nature themselves. We're all condemned to die. We're all condemned to have our loved ones die. The older I get, the more salient that becomes. In my 20s, that wasn't a very powerful idea. Now in my 60s, it certainly is. We're confronted with forces of nature that are antithetical to human flourishing and which ultimately we cannot control. I mean, we can do our best to deal with pandemics, with famine, with flood, with fires, with all sorts of things like that. And that dimension of helplessness, by the way, is becoming increasingly significant as we're faced with global climate change, which I don't believe. I think it's too late to do anything about that one, frankly. People aren't motivated enough. The other source of suffering is injustice. We're all vulnerable to being brutalized, killed, oppressed by other human beings. And those two sources of suffering, Freud thought, were intrinsic to human life. And so what happens when, to the extent that we're aware of those sources of suffering, and this is very interesting because actually, you know, for all of Freud's hostility to religion, he really is making the point that religion addresses suffering, at least. We look for salvation. We look for someone or something that can deliver us from this terrible condition of helplessness. And in doing so, he thought we are thrown back on the experience of infancy, when it was only our parents who could protect us from the world around, and without them we would die very quickly. And so we seek an all-powerful God to deliver us from suffering, to save us, and that God will ensure that the wicked will be punished, because in the real world they very often are not, and we will live forever in an afterlife, and so on. I mean, this was his take on the Abrahamic religious doctrines. Now, I think Freud commits a mistake here. As brilliant as Freud is, I'm a big fan of Freud, but he commits a mistake, which he doesn't seem to recognize that these sorts of beliefs are cultivated in us from the outside, from our surrounding social world. It's not like one day someone wakes up and thinks, oh, you know, God will deliver me from suffering, right? The very idea of God is a culturally infused idea, or an ideologically infused idea. So we have to look outside the human mind to understand then the problem that Freud is trying to come to grips with. And that brings me to an intersection between Freud's theory of religion and the political sphere. I mentioned when I introduced the book, The Future of an Illusion, that Freud was writing in a politically charged environment, a very dangerous, very uncertain environment. And actually, not unlike the political environment that in many parts of the world is facing us today, with the rise of authoritarian leaders, the dangerous authoritarian leaders. And it can't have escaped him that the issues he's dealing with in his book on religion also pertain to politics. That is, the political sphere is very much concerned with the same sorts of issues that Freud says religion is concerned with. The political sphere is concerned with human vulnerability, right? I mean, what are we trying to get out of politics? We're trying to get safety. We're trying to get protection. We're trying to get support for dealing with injustice. We're trying to prevent injustice. We're trying to develop policies that protect us from the forces of nature, be it disease, be it climate change, and so on. And that has a very important implication. And that implication, unfortunately, is that we look, or we have an inclination to be receptive to those leaders who offer us salvation, however illusionary that salvation is. So just as Freud thought the belief in God is an illusion because we believe it, because we want to believe it, because life is hard and life is painful and we are fragile and we are vulnerable. By the same token, this opens us to exploitation by leaders who present themselves as all-powerful and who promise us illusions of salvation. This was very, very clearly understood, I think, by a man whose work is so important today, and his work is not really well known. Pardon me. His name was Roger Monicarl. He was a man who lived in the first he was a 20th century figure. And he came from a wealthy British family. He was a very smart guy. After World War I, he went to Cambridge University to study philosophy and continued his studies in Vienna, Austria, with the Vienna Circle of Philosophers. After getting his PhD in philosophy, he got a second PhD in anthropology, and he became a practicing psychoanalyst. In 1932, Monicarl was invited by a friend of his, a diplomat, an Australian man named Arthur Jenkin, who was, it is suspected, eventually murdered by the Nazis, planted a bomb in his airplane. He was invited to come to Germany. And 1932 was an important year politically in Germany. There were very important elections going on, and this whole process culminated in Hitler becoming der Führer, the leader, in 1933. And Jenkin invited Monicarl to come and attend some of Hitler's rallies, where Hitler would get up and there'd be a massive crowd. Goebbels would speak. Goebbels was the minister of propaganda. Hitler would speak. And Monicarl was really interested in what was going on in this frightening scenario where, as he said, the crowd became like a huge monster, a brainless monster, a mindless monster. And basically, Monicarl said there was a pattern, and this is the pattern of authoritarian propaganda. And he wrote a paper on this, which was published in 1941, during the war. I think it's an extraordinarily significant paper, even though there's a lot in it that's confusing and too colored by some of his particular psychoanalytic beliefs. But it's very, very insightful. Basically, what Monicarl says is this: the authoritarian politician cultivates a sense of helplessness, of vulnerability in his audience. Now, so in a way, you see, Monicarl is filling in that missing piece in Freud's analysis as applied to politics. So, of course, from Freud, we can say, well, we all have this we try to avoid thinking about it too much, but this awareness of human vulnerability and suffering and helplessness, the fragility of life. The skillful political propagandist exploits that, revs it up, makes it overwhelmingly painful. So the first step in doing this, Monicarl says, as he observed Hitler doing, is to cultivate a sense of hopelessness and depression in the audience. The people listening to Hitler would say to them, talk about the defeat of Germany in World War, pardon me, I'm just checking my time here. In World War I, the humiliation of Germany, the greatness of the German nation has been brought to its knees. We are the laughing stock of the world, so on and so on and so on and so on. We've let ourselves down. And once they are immersed in anguish and depression and bleakness and sense of failure, then Hitler changes his tune and he says, yes, you see, but it's not really you. It's the Jews, it's the communists, it's the international bankers, it's the globalists. They are destroying our greatness, the greatness of our nation, the greatness of our people. So he then cultivates sort of a paranoid attitude. And if you've fallen into depression in the first phase, then it's very tempting to shift the blame to someone else, to some group. And this is going to be usually an identity group, right? A group that's racialized, or a religious minority, or something of this nature. Particularly if there's traditional, deep-seated ideological suspicion of them, like there was in German-speaking lands, about Jews for at least 800 years before the Nazis came along. So once people are worked up into terror, then the authoritarian propagandist offers a magical solution. Join us. Only us. Only I can make Germany great again. We'll crush our enemies and have 1,000 years of glory. You join the party, all this stuff. Now, as an aside, we began with really a question or a statement about the American elections. In fact, back in 1915, no, sorry, I'm not awake yet. It's early morning here today. In 2015, when Donald Trump announced his candidacy to run for president of the United States, when he made his very first speech, I was deeply worried, because that very first speech really followed exactly the pattern that Roger Monicarl described. Exactly. It was textbook. I don't think it's because Donald Trump knew anything about Monicarl's work, or indeed knew much about the Third Reich, but he had a gut instinct of how to manipulate people. And so while all my nice friends are saying, oh, he's a joke, ha, 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 I said, no, this is a very dangerous person. And we see this pattern all over the world. Unfortunately, it has a powerful, powerful grip on the populace. I have not studied sufficiently the rhetorical style of your leader Modi, but I would not be surprised if you find the very same pattern. In fact, I would bet on it. We find it in Hungary with Viktor Orban. We find it in Brazil with Jair Bolsonaro. With all of these strongman leaders, all very dangerous people. Now, I'll move from there to dehumanization. So remember that pattern that I just described. First, you get people depressed. You emphasize their helplessness, their victimization, their suffering. And then we all have a well of suffering to draw on. Then you scare them, saying, well, it's not your fault. It's these evil ones over here. That second phase is crucial for dehumanization. Because what often happens then is that explicitly or implicitly, those who are targeted as the enemy either outside of the state or within the state itself, and that the latter is the most dangerous, are represented there very often as subhuman creatures, as monsters, as demonic beings, as bloodthirsty predators, as parasites, disease-carrying parasites. What that does is it gives permission for atrocity, as well as motivating atrocity. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how that works. And actually, before I do, I think it's important to notice that this is not always explicit, particularly in secular societies. It's often not the case that the victim of dehumanization is described as literally a beast or a monster. And the reason for that is that that way of speaking is less socially acceptable than it once was. But a skillful propagandist can get around that. I mean, often they do speak explicitly of others as less than human. But they can also use indirect language to conjure up that idea in the minds of their audience. They can talk about, American politicians talk about people swarming across our southern borders. And as soon as you say swarm, what does that conjure up? Something like insects, right? Or the breeding grounds of terrorism in madrasas. Again, the breeding grounds, that's a dehumanizing image. It can always be denied. Oh, no, I just meant it metaphorically. But what it does is it affects the minds of listeners in such a way that they think of these others then as less than human. Or criminality is another one. It's very old. They're essentially criminal. You know, they're immoral. They're bad to the bone. They can't be changed. Well, that's just a fancy way of saying they're demonic. They're evil. So I've been studying this phenomenon for, about 15 years now. And I've changed my views on it a little bit since my first book, which was Less Than Human, came out in 2011. My newer views, which are a refinement of the older views, are in my latest book. Well, actually, it's right behind me here. When I do interviews and stuff, I put them behind me, sort of advertise the book. That's on inhumanity, dehumanization, and how to resist it. And my next book, which will be out next year, called Making Monsters, will go more deeply into this. So I want to briefly tell you what all this is about over the next, let's see, how much time do I have here? Oh, I've got almost a half hour. I can do a lot. I want to tell you what my view is on this and why I think it's important. Well, in a way, I've already told you why it's important. Because it's a tool that people who want us to do harm to others use to exploit our sense of helplessness and vulnerability, and to use that then in the service of toxic political ideologies and indeed atrocities. The word dehumanization is used in lots and lots and lots of different ways, very different ways. And in a way, that's a problem because often when people are talking about dehumanization, they either have an idea of it that's so general that it can't really be theorized properly, or they talk past each other because they mean different things by the word. So I think it's very, very important when we're talking about dehumanization to be very explicit about what we mean by it. It's not because there's one correct understanding of dehumanization and all the others are incorrect. It's just because the word means lots of different things. So let me start by telling you what I mean by dehumanization. What I mean by dehumanization is the attitude of conceiving of others as subhuman creatures. So, on that account of dehumanization, let me repeat it. It's the attitude of conceiving of others, of thinking of others as subhuman creatures. So, on that account, dehumanization happens in people's heads. It's psychological. Right? It's about what we believe about others. But it's not just psychological, because to understand dehumanization, you need to understand what's in people's heads, but you also need to understand what people's heads are in. You need to understand the social and political world surrounding them, because, on my view, dehumanization is a psychological response to political forces. That's one reason why it's been very hard to theorize properly, because it's standing on that boundary, that interface between the external, social, political realm and the realm of psychology. Now, notice I didn't simply say it's thinking of others as subhuman animals. I said subhuman creatures. And that marks a real change from my 2011 account. So, why do people do that? Well, people get us to do that. I've already told you that much. Our leaders who present themselves as God on earth and who are practically worshiped by their faithful followers as omnipotent and omniscient beings, they encourage us to think of others as less than human creatures. Well, why should they do that? I think there's a very important element of human nature that we need to sort of put on the table in order to understand this process. Here's a fact about our species, Homo sapiens. We are incredibly social species. We are more sociable, more reliant on one another than any other mammal. And we really have to look at insects, right? Ants and bees to find this sort of level of intense sociability that humans have. But of course, humans' life is way more complex than the life of any insect. And we are way more complex than any insect, right? So this is very important. As far as we know, for millions of years, Homo sapiens and our ancestors have lived in groups, have been highly, highly social, have had a cooperative way of life, and we depend on our very survival for it. Any one of us, if we were to be dropped in the middle of the Brazilian rainforest, I wouldn't bet on us living very long. We need one another. We're dependent on one another. Now, as any biologist will tell you, any social animal has to have very powerful inhibitions against doing harm to other members of their community. And the reason is obvious, because if people, or if animals are at each other's throats, they cannot maintain a social way of life. So this sort of gets built in, that we do not harm or do not seriously harm other members of our community. Now, of course, sometimes things get out of hand and there's harm and there's lethal harm, but that's exceptional. We human beings are very, very highly social, and therefore have to have very, very powerful internal obstacles to doing violence to one another. Our sociability is also not confined to the immediate community. We know this. We know that for way back into prehistory, communities are in touch with one another. Our sociability, and therefore the inhibitions against acts of violence, extends to strangers. Right. So that's a feature of human life. And you might ask, yeah, but David, this is a bit crazy, because if we look at human history, it's soaked in blood, in atrocity, in horror. Well, there's more to the story. We're also very clever. We've got these great big brains, and we're capable of thinking to ourselves, capable of imagining, oh, wouldn't it be advantageous to go over the mountain and kill our neighbors? We can take their stuff. We can steal their resources. We can enslave them. We can oppress them. Right? So we have this power of imagination, which is a wonderful thing, that also enables us to imagine terrible courses of action and understand the attractions of those courses of action. Now, that picture, as I presented it, is sort of it represents a deadlock, doesn't it? Because if on one hand, human communities, particularly under the guidance of leaders who aren't at risk, can be motivated to want to do violence to other human communities, but at the same time, if there's this built-in horror of spilling human blood, then there's a sort of they cancel each other out. But again, human beings, being the clever creatures that we are, over the centuries, developed ways of overcoming our inhibitions, our very natural inhibitions against doing harm. And there are many ways that we have invented over the thousands of years to make this possible. The use of intoxicating drugs is very, very old. People prepare themselves for war by taking drugs, hashish, opium, all sorts of more exotic substances, and alcohol, of course. Certain sorts of mind-altering rituals that disinhibit warriors. Certain sorts of religious ideologies that God or the gods want us to do these things and will offer us salvation if we do them. And dehumanizing propaganda. Dehumanizing propaganda is one way that human beings have found to disinhibit, to disable these powerful inhibitions against acts of violence. I want to say something about those inhibitions, because you might think that sounds a little bit crazy. It actually isn't. You see, the picture we get of lethal violence, say in warfare, in say the movies, is really often unrealistic. You know, someone can go up to another person and stick a knife in their guts while looking into their eyes and kill them, and then just walk away. There are people like that, but it's a very small minority of the population. If you kill someone up close and personal, even if your life is in danger, and particularly if you're looking into their eyes, it can drive you crazy. It destroys, the experience destroys the killer. There's a growing amount of stuff on this now, research. It's generally called moral injury. People who go to war and they kill are damaged by the act of killing. And I think the reason for that is that You have to do violence to something in yourself, these profound biologically rooted inhibitions, in order to perform these acts. Anyway, dehumanization helps. Why? Well, if we can think of others as dangerous subhuman creatures, as predators, as traditionally unclean animals, then it does two things to our minds. One is it gives us permission to harm them, right? We don't have to worry, generally speaking, against stepping on a cockroach or poisoning a rat. Although there are communities who refrain from that. It's not typical of human beings. Or killing a dangerous animal that may tear us apart, a vicious predator. So it gives permission, because these creatures in various social ideologies are seen as less than human. And by that I mean having less intrinsic value than those whom we consider our fellow human beings. And it also motivates us, you see. We have to protect ourselves from them. We have to exterminate them. And that's why, tragically, two things. We find this phenomenon in virtually every genocide, certainly the ones that I have studied. Right? Dehumanizing the victims of genocide is just so typical. It's so standard. I would be really surprised to find a genocide in which this didn't happen. And tragically, it's again, typically some of the most vulnerable, the most marginalized members of a society who are dehumanized in that kind of way. And in these genocidal episodes, genocide is, of course, the extreme. These processes happen in other situations as well. Tragically, again, those who commit these acts see themselves as destroying evil, as saving the world. Now, genocides have this very moralistic component to them. Right along. You can go back to the first genocide of the 20th century, the Namibian genocide, right up through the 20th century, and we can go the other way as well. They tend to be very moralistic. We are doing right. We are doing good. It takes people of extraordinary moral strength to slaughter thousands and thousands and thousands of others. And actually, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, made a speech to SS officers. I think it was 1943. We have a recording of the speech in which he says exactly that. It takes someone with a very, great moral strength to manage to take the lives of thousands of others, see the corpses lined up, and be able to continue doing it. It's well, enough said. Okay, so look, I've told you, we had charted an interesting course today, from the American election to propaganda to dehumanization, and I've told you what I think dehumanization is. I've told you what function I think it serves. And that involved me talking to you about the inner obstacles we have to doing lethal violence to others, and even sublethal violence to others, and how dehumanization is one way that we overcome those obstacles, or rather, the leaders get us to overcome those obstacles. And now I want to tell you for the last portion of my talk, a kind of tension in that, right? So I want to go a little bit more deeply into what happens when people dehumanize others and how this turns the dehumanized others, transforms them in their eyes into monsters and demons. Right. So let's go back to human beings being ultra social, super social animals. Part of our social makeup, which is just so deeply rooted within us, is that the sight of another human being up close, I believe, triggers a kind of responsiveness, looking into the eyes of another person. To put it crudely, we can't help but think human when we see them. The side of a human face, and we know that neurologically faces are processed differently than any other visual stimuli, right? There's something very unique about our relationship to human faces. And I would argue human voices and so on. So as you look into my eyes and I look into yours, my thesis is we cannot but respond to one another as fellow human beings. And this closes down violence, impulses to violence. The impulses might be there, but the inhibitions swing in. But, so look, if we're as simple as that, we wouldn't have genocides, we wouldn't have wars, and we wouldn't have people standing aside while others in their communities suffer. It's not as simple as that. And here's the reason. Human culture depends to a great extent on expertise. So the sort of the acquisition of knowledge, and it's being passed on from one generation to next, as societies become complex, require experts. Experts are the people who are supposed to know. They're granted that position by their society. They are the authorities. And you see, that's very important because most of what we know, we haven't observed with our own eyes. We're told. We're told by historians, or we're told by scientists. We're told by people in a position of epistemic authority. And if we grant them that authority, we will often set aside what our senses tell us because we have faith in, their superior understanding. So if this is my wedding ring here, if I were to take it to a jeweler, and I said, well, I have a gold ring here, I want it cleaned, and the jeweler looks at it and says, I'm sorry, Mr. Smith, that's not gold, it's brass. I would accept it, right? Because the jeweler has expertise that I don't have. The jeweler can put a drop of acid or determine the weight of the metal and determine what it is. So we defer to authorities. How about when, even in situations where what the authorities tell us contradict what our senses tell us? So I'm sitting at this table here. You can't see it, but my computer is on a box, elevated a bit, so I'm not looking down, and the box is on the table. And the table looks like it's totally solid. There are no gaps. There's no empty space. But if I were to speak to a physicist, they would say, oh, Professor Smith, you're totally wrong about this. This table is mostly empty space. It's these tiny atoms, surrounded by a great deal of empty space. It just looks like there are no gaps in it to you. Now, I accept that. I can't see it, but I accept it because the physicist is someone who is supposed to know. They're in that position of authority, rational authority. And generally speaking, it's totally reasonable, even necessary, to accept these things. And it's not always fancy, scientists and so on. It could be your parents when you're growing up. Look, as a child, think of all the things you learned because you were told, don't touch that snake. That one is poisonous. Don't touch the hot stove. Eating this is good for you. Eating this is bad for you, right? And, if we're smart, we accept these things. But the problem comes when the authority involved is either in the service of a dangerous political ideology or doesn't really know. And there are a lot of people like that who present themselves as knowing. President Trump talked about killing the coronavirus by injecting bleach, right? And some foolish people actually drank bleach after that, right? So the problem comes when the authority figure says, okay, I'll tell you, those people over there, those Jews, those Mexicans, those blacks, those Muslims, whoever it is, they might look human, but they're not really human. And when the authority tells people that, and it's backed up by frightening propaganda of the sort I described earlier, then it's very, very easy for people to accept these things. But once they accept them, now we're in an interesting situation. I'll be wrapping it up shortly. I realize the time. On the one hand, say confronted with one of these so-called counterfeit human beings, these dehumanized human beings, on the one hand, we're told that they're subhuman creatures. And we take that on, unfortunately. A lot of people think, well, I wouldn't take it on. Yeah, right. You would. Most of us would, under the right circumstances. So we accept that. But we also cannot help, as I said before, seeing the other as a human being, a fellow human being. And what that means is that in situations of dehumanization, the dehumanizers have two images at the same time of those whom they dehumanize. They're totally human. That's the gut level response, the boom, looking into another person's eyes response. And they're totally subhuman. They're humans like us, and they're dangerous animals. And this has a very, very, very disturbing effect. And I explain this in detail on Inhumanity. It turns them, in the dehumanizer's eyes, into monsters. A monster, a fictional monster, of course all monsters are fictional, is typically a combination of incompatible things. And very typically, a combination of the human and the subhuman. And in turning them into monsters in this way, it licenses the most terrible, terrible things that human beings have done to one another and will do to one another. This has been a sketch of 15 years of work. And it's a privilege to be able to speak about it at this crucial moment in history. I just want to close with one very general point. I mentioned climate change early on when I was talking about Freud and helplessness and vulnerability. As climate change affects us more and more, it's almost certainly going to be the case that humanity will be faced with a refugee crisis, the likes of which there has never been. the collapse of infrastructures, famine, flood, and the vast movement of populations. I want you just to imagine this for a moment. Imagine the entire population of Bangladesh seeking refuge in India. This is a perfect situation for the most toxic, the most dangerous forms of dehumanizing rhetoric to be used to get us to perform acts of violence against others. And I really think we need to be prepared for this. That's why I wrote my last book. You know, I wrote it in a way, it's not for academics. This is way too important a topic just for academics. This is a topic for everyone. We need to understand these phenomena. We need to be prepared. We need to do as much as we can to make sure that we handle the crises confronting us now, but even more so the crises that will confront us with humanity and in a way that is less hideous than the way that we've managed these things earlier in our history. I'll finish there. Thank you for giving me time.
Thank you so much, sir, for that wonderful talk, because I'm sure that all of us here are thinking about what you have just unpacked in front of us. And I'm sure that we'll have a lot of questions following this. Maybe I can start it off with a couple of things that I thought about listening to you. It seems as if this dehumanization, the process of dehumanization, is something which kicks in when we encounter somebody other than ourselves, when communities become larger and come into contact with other communities, or when we somehow encounter the alien. But suppose we have something like an isolated island community which exists all by themselves. Would they still have this dehumanization or this intrinsic thing in them which dehumanizes others from within their own community? Another thing that I wanted to ask was, in such a community, would the leaders, the people who have power, would they project these things onto supernatural beings or some sort of something actually non-human which the community would believe in? And whether this belief in the supernatural, could that be a kind of a vaccine which prevents the dehumanization of humans? Could we maybe imagine a collective danger which is equally present for all humans and dehumanize that instead of humans? So maybe this is something I wanted to ask you.
Okay, so with respect to you've really raised 3 points. I'll see if I can remember all 3 of them. The first had to do with, and the first 2 were very closely connected. It has to do with the encountering others outside of one's group. Well, it's very important to understand that the idea of inside and outside is itself an act of political line drawing, right? So it's not like there's us and then there are these others. That's only the case if we make it the case, right? And it's very interesting watching how these things change over time. I mean, one of the interesting facts about human beings is that we can, former enemies can become allies. They were them, now they're us. And former members of our own communities can become aliens. We see, that's the flux of history. So these lines of demarcation are not out there in the world. They're lines that it's a political act. They're lines that we draw. So that led into the issue about an isolated community. I mean, in a way, this is a thought experiment because in the real world, historically speaking, every human community has been in touch with other human communities, even groups that are now pretty isolated have in the past, like the Andaman Islands, for instance, have in the past been in touch with others. So it's a philosophical fiction, but we can learn things from philosophical fictions. And I would say, no, under those circumstances, there would be no cause, right? Dehumanization is driven by, it's a motivated state of mind. It's driven by the urge to harm others. And if there aren't people there to harm, it's just not going to be present, in my view. The third was, what about the idea of a dangerous, if I understood you correctly, supernatural entity that we could all get together and dehumanize? Well, common enemies are very helpful. And my prediction, I think, under those circumstances, this is the classic science fiction thing. The aliens come and the human race is threatened. My guess is we would start accusing each other of being allies of the dangerous non-human being, right? So, because it would have to be so overwhelming that the existing political tensions between human groups are just obliterated by the common threat. And as soon as that threat went away, yeah. I'm not optimistic about many things in this world, but I am hopeful. So it would be great if that solved the problem.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I think we have a couple of questions from our audience in the chat box. Maybe we can address them. Let me just scroll to the first one.
Yeah, quite a few have been popping up there, I saw.
Yeah, so this is from Shanti Mathai, and she says, what do you say looking at the evolution of oppressing and dehumanizing nature or mentality of Homo sapiens over the centuries? What about this? Is this evolutionary in nature? Is this some sort of thing that is probably, I don't know, survival of the fittest or something?
No, I don't think it is. I think some of it, right? So some of the psychological features that make this possible are perhaps products of evolution. Certainly, like our hypersociality, that dehumanization is a response to, right? In a way, dehumanization is the solution of a problem. The problem is it's hard for us to do violence to each other. That's certainly a product of evolution, as our evolution as social animals. The thing about the natural world, that is important, and I didn't have the time to get into that. For a very long time, human beings have thought about the natural world as a hierarchy with, the more perfect beings at the top, and they have the supreme value, and then it goes lower and lower and lower and lower. And so insects, for instance, would be very low on this hierarchy. And that's very important for understanding dehumanization. It's important because the D of dehumanization, you see, when we think of others as less than, there's got to be some kind of hierarchy involved. Otherwise, less than or greater than would not make any sense at all. Now, the idea of a natural hierarchy actually just is scientifically empty, but it's had for for many centuries, a powerful grip on the human imagination, and still does. It still does. I think it's something which is built into the psychology of very, very, very many human beings, and I think there are good reasons for that. But that would take me a very long time to explain. I explain it in the book. So yeah, that's that way of thinking, that attitude towards nature is a crucial component of dehumanization.
So Dr. Tania Rivera is asking you whether there is any way to break this pattern of dehumanizing. Is it possible to break out?
Sure. Well, we should try. We should do our best. That's what I mean when I say I'm hopeful but not optimistic. We need to push on. In the book, I talk about a variety of strategies. One is understanding ourselves enough to be able to recognize our own vulnerability to toxic propaganda and ideology, that we're all potential dehumanizers. And that requires a certain amount of education in human nature, which certainly is not part of any education system that I know of. Another is a proper understanding of history, because we all tend to idealize our own histories and not confront the atrocities that us, whoever we are, have perpetrated. You know, nations are born in violence and sustained by oppression, and Americans are particularly bad at this because we've never been forced to recognize the horrors that we've committed. But you see, it's very important to understand history in that way, because when you recognize that it has happened, right, that we have done this, then it induces a kind of humility, the recognition that we can do it again, or maybe we're doing it now. The other is outward looking, supporting social institutions that that promote democracy, respect for individual human beings, a free press, a free judiciary. Now, that's not magical, because authoritarian leaders, one of their first tasks is to control these things, right? And the free press can circulate toxic information, misinformation, just as much as it can real information. I'm going to talk a lot about this in my next book, which is at the publishers now. A kind of moral courage is important, that we address things as we see them. We address dehumanization when we see it. I have said nothing about racism and dehumanization, but I think they're very, 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 very closely tied together. So we need to not just wait until others are being called animals or vermin, when they're racialized, when they're denigrated because of race. And my conception of race is a very broad one, actually. It includes lots of things that are not considered race. So Elizabeth Wilkerson, in her new book, which is up here someplace, distinguishes race from caste. I don't make that distinction. I think they're forms of the same thing. Finally, I think this is really, really important. Remember, dehumanizing propaganda plays on our vulnerabilities. The more people are suffering, the more the easier it is for them to adopt dehumanizing views, because their suffering is so salient. A just society in which people are not suffering needlessly is, I think, very, very important, right? If you look at the rise of these genocidal regimes, they typically come about in periods of instability and suffering. Pandemics is historically a very important one. When people feel vulnerable, they can be exploited to do bad things. Now, like I said earlier on, there's a lot of vulnerability and helplessness and suffering just built into human life in the best of circumstances. Yeah, we're always left with that. But there's a lot of excess. There's a lot of needless suffering in the world, right? And the closer we can come to diminishing that, I think that's the closest we come to a vaccine for dehumanization. And that requires political action.
So next we have a fairly long question from Professor A.M. Givergis. Maybe I'll just read it out.
Okay.
Dr. Shantakumar invoked Hannah Arendt and the concept of suffering while introducing the theme. You referred to this and spoke poignantly about the vulnerability of man or the human. To live and to be among men, says Arendt, is the essence of the human condition. One could use to die and to cease to be among men as synonyms. Our networked existence today conveys a semblance of being among men, but within the network of finance capital and communication networks, the refugee, the migrant, black lives, ordinary lives, and man in general, even the middle-level experts who create webs, are left alone. So would you comment on this paradox of being alone and vulnerable while the basic systemic model is the network?
Yeah, well, Arendt, I mean, it's typically insightful of her. She's not someone who I've studied much, but so insightful. And there, she's of course alluding in her own idiom to what I call ultra sociality or extreme sociality, that living a human life is living in connection with others. It's just built in. To really address this, we have to understand something very, very important about the concept of the human. I mean, we can. How do I want to start this? The concept of the human is itself a concept that is essentially ideological, right? So I want to make a distinction here between our automatic responsiveness to one another as fellow creatures of the same kind, right? And I describe that as seeing human. But as a concept, the notion of humanness is ideological. That's one reason why there's a great deal of disagreement about what counts as human, even in the sciences. And certainly if we look across the board at vernacular notions of the human. I think that the way that the concept of the human works is it means something like my kind. So it's essentially ideological, essentially political concept. Those who are human are my kind. And that the boundaries of my kind can be very narrow, or they can be very, very broad. Obviously, I'm in favor of very, very broad. I want the concept of the human to embrace all of every member of our species and maybe even other species. So those who are excluded from the networks of sociality, the migrant being a perfect example, or those who are extruded from it, the racial minority or the religious minority, in the eyes of the others, those in positions of power and authority, they are not human, simply in virtue of being labeled not my kind. In other words, not my kind equals non-human, or in practice subhuman. So those who are most vulnerable, those who suffer most, are typically, tragically, those who are extruded from the category of the human.
Yes, sir. So we have a question from Professor Prashant Kumar, and he's talking about the recent instances of dehumanization being extended to institutions like the parliament and the judiciary, they seem to be cases of using desirable means to obtain undesirable ends, especially in the aftermath of the pandemic. Laws detrimental to weaker sections of the nation are passed, favoring global corporates. Could you comment on this?
I don't know enough about the specifics of that, of the details there to comment intelligently, and I try not to speak about things that I'm ignorant of.
Could it be probably that these democratic institutions, which should possibly prevent us from passing these dehumanizing laws, they are being somehow subverted?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. So look, dehumanization, in my view, is virtually always about people in positions of power getting their way. So yeah, of course. That's why, I began with the statement by Martin Luther King about the moral arc of history bending towards justice. And I said, well, it only does if we keep pushing very, very hard. Right? There are always powerful people who want to get their way. And one of the best ways of getting your way, if it involves doing harm to others, is to dehumanize those others. And of course, when we take on these dehumanizing perspectives rather than pushing back, it all seems right and reasonable, unfortunately.
So we have a question from Amiya Kumar Patra. Time and again, we have gone against our human grain to harm, kill, or even wipe out each other. Then what is the future of the human race? Do you think that evolution will eventually take us to a better state?
Well, evolution just changes. It doesn't work for the good, and it's what evolution works by, whatever increases the reproductive success of the individuals in the population. So evolution in that sense, no, I don't think so. I think it's up to us. This is a responsibility that's squarely on our shoulders, and we can't look to evolution or to any other force of that nature to save us. We've got to save ourselves here. And I certainly think this is possible. But I'm very doubtful about whether it will happen. As I have a reputation for being very dark, about these things. And when I'm talking to my colleagues on Facebook or whatever, I always say, I hope I'm wrong. Now I'm wrong that I say we're not going to take on these challenges. Maybe we will. I hope so.
Speaking of Facebook, our next question is from Usha Kiran, who's asking us whether social media and these democratic means of communication, will they have any sort of role to play in countering this kind of a thing?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So in my next book, the Making Monsters book, there's a chapter on my theory of ideology. And then the next chapter is like an extended case study of dehumanizing ideology. And it's about the racialization of Jews in Europe in the Middle Ages, and the continuity between, say, that in the 13th century right up to the present, anti-Semitic ideologies. Now, without going into details, one thing that's crucial in that process is the reproduction of representations of others. This is sort of the epidemiology of dehumanizing beliefs, right? They have to spread, and they have to be reproduced in order to spread. If we look historically, like if you go back to the 13th century, the spreading of dehumanizing images of Jews in Europe was incredibly slow and inefficient. Most people couldn't read. Most Christians couldn't read anyway. So they couldn't read that Jews were beasts. It had to be through word of mouth or through art. You know, you came into town and you saw these dehumanizing images, or through traveling religious plays about the crucifixion of Christ and so on. As people became more literate in Europe, and after the printing press was developed by Gutenberg, then dehumanizing ideas could spread much, much more rapidly, right? So in the 18th century, they could spread much more rapidly. 20th century, Nazis come along and they realize, oh, the radio is a wonderful tool for spreading these toxic beliefs. And so they actually made efforts to develop radios that ordinary people could afford so they could get these things into everyone's home. And now we have, of course, the internet. So what we have is increasingly, from over the last 800 years, more and more and more and more and more efficient and rapid ways of spreading representations of others. Now, I've talked about dehumanizing representations, but of course, it could work the same way with humanizing representations of others. So what we have here is a tool that, see, anything that distributes, any mechanism that distributes information can distribute misinformation, right? Equally effectively. So I guess my answer to that question is, yeah, the internet certainly can play a role, but can play a role in the opposite as well, in the opposite way as well, as we've seen with the proliferation of, you know, neo-Nazi ideologies around the world and so on. Unfortunately, I think that the themes exploited by dehumanizers, say the dehumanizing stories, are typically more powerful and influential than the humanizing ones. I mean, promoting fear is just tremendously powerful. So the humanizers and their propaganda tend to have the best stories. So that makes me doubt a little bit that our international connectedness over the World Wide Web is going to bend the arc of history in the right way.
Our next question from Manjot is probably related to what you have just said. He's asking about whether there is this humanizing force, an alternative force which can counter the effects of dehumanization. Is there anyone working on developing such a force, or anybody?
Well, we've got it in us. Remember, if I'm right, dehumanization happens precisely because we so readily see each other as fellow human beings. The big question is how to enhance the effectiveness of those tendencies. And to my mind, the only way that can be done is to combat the tendencies in the opposite direction, the dehumanizing forces. Unfortunately, people in power are not too keen to do that, right? So if you want to have a war, well, it's really helpful to demonize the people that you're not going to go out on the battlefield. You're going to get other people to sacrifice their lives to go out on the battlefield. And you got to convince them that this is worth doing. And the dehumanizing propaganda does that quite effectively. So I think the way to look at this is more, given that in my view, we're naturally inclined to respond to one another as fellow human beings. The battle is against the forces of dehumanization rather than trying to develop some kind of counter force.
Dr. Muthukumar's question is, if I may interpret it, is asking whether this dehumanization may be legitimate at times. Maybe does somebody actually deserve it? Maybe like if a colonizer is being dehumanized by the colonized, is it okay?
I don't think it ever is okay. First of all, it's false. Whoever the other is, they're not a monster. They're not a beast. And I'm glad that Dr. Kumar said, refer to that as dehumanization. It is. Dehumanizing the dehumanizer only perpetuates the problem. It only perpetuates the problem. Now you can understand why it's understandable for colonized and oppressed people to dehumanize those that colonize and oppress them. You know, emotionally, it's totally understandable, but it's false. And I think in the long run, and actually in the short run, it's much more important to see those who are responsible for atrocities as holding up a mirror to what we all might become. Right? You know, people will say Hitler was a monster. No, he wasn't. And to think it's a monster is not to understand Hitler. And so, by the same token, not to understand ourselves. And I think that's true of all of these cases.
Could you maybe talk about whether dehumanization is whether there is any link between Ionesco's philosophy that he puts out in Rhinoceros of people transforming into the monstrous? And
that's first of all, I've never read it, so I can't comment on it. But I'm going to make a note that I have to read it. So I can't answer that question unless it's just bullshit, and I don't do bullshit. Ionesco, the rhinoceros, is that?
The rhinoceros, yeah. It's about this town full of people who gradually start turning into rhinoceri.
Oh, cool. Okay. I will read that.
So the next question is about the post-human and whether the dehumanizing process has something to do with this technological transformation into something beyond what is human, the post-human.
Yeah. I'm rather unsympathetic to post-humanism for a couple of reasons. One, which might seem a little bit trivial, is I don't think folks in that tradition understand the concept of the human properly. The human is just whoever is us. And in that sense, there needn't be any post-human at all. I mean, you implant some computer chips in my brain, I'm still human, only if I'm human in the eyes, in your eye, if in your eyes, I'm one of you, right? And I'm also, people talk about us getting transformed into the post-human. Well, the us it's not going to be us. It's going to exclude these enhancements are, unless one has a very rosy picture of the future, going to exclude the vast bulk of humanity. So, yeah, I'm just not. I don't like science fiction either, and I think that to my mind, and I may be totally biased and wrong about this, there's just something so unrealistic about these sorts of fantasies and terribly detached from the realities of human suffering. I think that's all I can say about that.
So the next question is from Yeshudas Chungat, who is asking you whether the present situation of religious terrorism is in any way related to your topic.
Yes, it is. In two ways. Religious ideologies are often in the service of dehumanization. And in a way, religious ideologies are especially suitable because one can invoke supernatural notions of the feared and despised other. And so they can be then used in the service of religiously motivated terrorism. But there's also another way in which religious ideologies can play into dehumanization. So in dehumanization, as I describe it, we demote others from the category of the human. So we are human, they are less than human. But there's another pattern we sometimes see historically, is that we are more than human. They are merely human, right? So again, there are religiously infused political ideologies that can harness that force as well. People simply elevating themselves above ordinary human beings.
So
and all of these forms of dehumanization or dehumanization-like phenomena, of course, enhance our capacity to do really awful things to one another.
So next question is from Aloka Patel, who is asking whether authoritarian propaganda is the only one responsible for violence. Has there been the other, which is, has the other never harmed authority?
I didn't hear the last thing. Has the other
never harmed authority?
Never harmed authority. I'm not sure I understand that. Yeah, there's something in this question I'm not properly understanding, but I'm going to try. And perhaps the questioner can clarify if I get things terribly wrong. First of all, the other isn't a given. The other is always created. Like I said, we draw lines. Those lines aren't there in nature. They're like national boundaries, right? They're not there in nature. So who counts as other and who counts as us is generated by a political act. Somehow, in order to dehumanize others, we have to be able to override our perception of them as human beings. Somehow that needs to happen. Now, the way that I've described it is in terms of positions, people positioned as authorities, say propagandists, as your questioner mentioned, right? Authoritarian propagandists, the Goebbelses, the Donald Trumps, the so on and so on. We can list lots and lots of them. But that's not often that's not the case, and it's rarely the whole story, rarely if ever. So very often, the authority is distributed through an existing community as just an ideology which has been cemented into that community for generations, hundreds or even thousands of years. So I grew up in the Deep South in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. It was the Jim Crow era. Blacks and whites were segregated. Black people lived in terrible poverty and danger and oppression. And it was just seen as common knowledge. It was just in the air that people breathed, that Black Americans were less than human, right? It didn't take a person, at the pulpit or on TV or, making pronouncements like this. It was sort of a distributed kind of authority. And yes, if we're going to use that term, in order to override their perceptions of those who oppress them as human, need some help from somewhere, right? In my view, it doesn't happen. Now, look, you can seeing someone as human doesn't mean that you like them or that you find them morally acceptable or anything like that. And we can certainly commit acts of violence without dehumanizing others. Some people get me wrong. They think I say, well, dehumanization is necessary for violence. No, it is not. It's not necessary. It's just helpful.
So if we need some sort of help in, looking beyond this urge to dehumanize, can that sort of come from the students and teachers of humanities, maybe? Because that is a question that John sir is asking us.
Yeah, I think it has to. So if we look at the social science literature, right? So let me back up a little bit. So almost all the literature on dehumanization is in psychology. I was really shocked to discover it's like 99% of it is social psychologists. And I think that literature is very limited precisely because it's not infused by a humanistic awareness. So, for instance, in the psychological literature, I think psychologists have gotten a lot wrong, actually. And I think the research methods are not helpful for understanding this phenomenon. But the point I want to concentrate on is they just tend to see dehumanization as something that happens in human minds, abstracted away from the political and social world. So if you read the psychological literature, I mean, they'll kind of mention it like propaganda a little bit, but it's really lip service. And to really understand dehumanization, we have to bring together lots of things. Certainly we need psychology. Anything about human behavior, we need psychology. But in doing psychology, the relevant psychology, we mustn't be bound by the disciplinary methodological restrictions that professional psychologists adhere to. We also need to understand the cultural dimensions of dehumanization. And we also need to understand the political and historical dimensions. Unless we're taking all of these things into account, we're not understanding dehumanization. So I think it's absolutely vital that people working in the humanities contribute to this sort of project. And sadly, of course, the humanities, I don't know how it is in India, but in the United States, the humanities are dying in universities. I mean, they're under-resourced. They're seen as far less significant than the STEM disciplines and so on. And we need them most right now.
So I think we are running a little bit short on time, so I'll just combine the last three questions. And
okay.
So the first question is from Ashwin Prashant. He's asking us whether the tendency of humans to create the other or an enemy to displace or dump one's own follies on, is it a natural tendency? Then we have a question from Usha Kiran, who is asking you whether maintaining a combined common history of mankind that isn't influenced by community or nation, is it feasible? And would it help curb the future propagation of ideologies that lead to dehumanization? And finally, we have a question on whether technology and technological advance contributes to dehumanization?
Okay. I'm trying to remember all these all these questions. The last one, definitely yes. I mean, as I said about the mechanisms of reproduction of representations of others, which rely on technology, yes. Technology is and has been for centuries important for dehumanization, not necessary but important, precisely because of its impact on communication. The prospect of an unbiased history of humanity, if I understood the question correctly, well, I didn't use the questioner's actual language. And if someone said unbiased, well, I don't think that's possible, and I don't think it's desirable. Whenever we're doing any project, we have biases, and it can be good biases or bad biases. But certainly, yes, isn't that the ideal, that we work towards an objective reckoning of humanity in our historical endeavors? Absolutely. And there are always ideological forces hostile to that. But we need to push back against that. And historians often do a very good job. Our educational systems often do a very poor job. So. And what was the first one?
It's about whether it is natural for humans to humanize.
Yeah. Well, natural is a tricky word. It's certainly, there's reason to think that once we situate others as others, that there are biases which come into effect there. And let's put it simply, look, it's always tempting to blame other people for our own difficulties, right? We all know that. We don't need psychologists to tell us that. So in that sense, it's natural. But by natural, I mean it's easy for us to do. Dehumanization, not so much. I think dehumanization depends on all sorts of other things. It's a more complicated phenomenon. Left to our own devices, I don't think dehumanization would happen outside of certain social and political structures.
Thank you, sir. We have one last question. It's about why people who have humane qualities, why are they never in positions of power? Why is it always that Hitler's
I wouldn't say they never are. There have been some outstanding examples, but look, Plato's Republic, he had this idea of the people who run the state, or in his language, the city, the polis, and they should all be people who don't want the job. That's what one of his requirements. If you want it, you're unsuitable, right? Because your motivation needs to be something like this. If I don't do it, it's going to be someone's going to do it who's going to do it even worse. So the problem is, of course, the paradox of power, isn't it? That people who achieve positions of power are very often motivated by the desire for power. And that seems to be the sort of person that your questioner would say is not infused with humane qualities. Yeah, it's a problem.
Thank you so much.
Ravind, I think we can now, because we have taken almost 45 minutes. So yeah.
So I think we can move on to our
Chelsea.
Thank you, Professor David, for that engaging and enlightening session. Thank you, Aravind sir, for effectively moderating the session. As we draw to the close of the inaugural session, I now request Dr. K.J. Verghese, Vice President of Prajna Foundation, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you all.
I think Verghese has lost his connection. I take this opportunity to thank Professor David Livingston Smith for making this wonderful. Now, Verghese has come. Verghese. Verghese?
One,
Please.
1 second. Yeah. Try to. So, second.
Verghese, please.
In fact, I cannot unmute. That's it.
I think Verghese is not getting the connection. So,
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. I think the internet connection is not stable. Can you hear me now? Can you?
yes.
You. Okay. So I went very fast. Dear Professor Smith, Dr. Kumar, Dr. Shant Palika Pillin, the host in Danny Matthew, the Matthew, principal of St. College, Dr. Johnson, members of the foundation, and dear professors and my research scholars. I'm sure the talk that you were listening to was in fact a wonderful one, full of on individual, collectivity, and systemic challenge. And I say that he's touched upon almost all sides of dehumanization. And finally, when we see the box, it's flooded with appreciation for our Professor Smith. And Pratina Foundation is really happy to have you, sir, for this talk, and have set the ball rolling for us, because we have another 3 more talks on individual activity and systemic challenges, and you have set the ball rolling, and I'm sure that other speakers will do justice to this topic. And the questions asked, I'm sure that all the listeners were in fact listening to the different sides, and they had so many questions, and at last Arvind sir had to moderate in such a way that otherwise it's almost 7:30 now. So, sir, it was an excellent speech, and we are all really happy about it, and we would like to hear from you again, maybe on another. And
sure.
I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Prashant Kumar, sir. Okay, we are here all because of him. Okay, we are all his scholars, in some way connected to this great man, okay, who guided us, in the right path so that we could be all our PhDs. And then, of course, this particular foundation, as the speaker said, the speaker, Dani, president, was formed that research and the research scholars work in unison and particularly on literary theories and literature in general. So we are very thankful to Dr. Prashant Kumar for his presence and his guideship. And we also have Reverend Dr. Prashant Parambil, the principal of host institution SH College Severa, and Dr. Rani Matthew, who welcomed us all, Dr. Lissy Matthew, principal of St. Teresa's College, for her presence, and all the members of the foundation and the scholars and teachers who attended. And we are all waiting for you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. The inaugural session has officially come to a close. Thank you all for being a wonderful audience. Once again, thank you, Professor David, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for
thank you.
making such an enlightening, really engaging and in fact, humanizing talk. Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Thank you so much. I'll write you. I will write you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All the best to you. I hope everything else goes really well.
Stay safe and healthy.
Yeah, you too, man.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.